Hey guys, Gold here. It's been a little while since I've done one of these late night rambles, but tonight I just kind of wanted to ramble about something that's been on my mind. So, as some of you may have been aware, I have been indulging in the background, among many, many other projects, a rewrite for Fire Emblem Fates. Now, Fire Emblem Fates is a game, or technically games, I guess, that I have a lot of fondness and affinity for. This was actually my first Fire Emblem game, or a game, whatever. I'll just call it a single game going forward for simplicity's sake. So it's the first Fire Emblem game that I ever played. I replayed all three routes quite a few times in middle and high school. And this was a little bit before I developed what I now call my writer brain, where I am, a lot more analytical and a lot more critical of the writing and the story and things that I engage with. So, it wasn't until like some years later that I, really like took a look back at the game, took a look at its overall plot and story and characters, and realized that yeah, it's not really the best in the narrative department. Like, I don't think it's the worst Fire Emblem story ever told. Then again, I haven't played like literally every Fire Emblem game, so I can't really vouch for that, anyways. But the point is, like, I do have a lot of nostalgic fondness for these games in spite of that. But I also do look back and acknowledge that, like, the story is kind of a mess on multiple fronts, and like that in and of itself can be a whole other video, and trust me, I'll dive into a lot of that whenever I finally get around to releasing my rewrite series or videos, whatever I decide to do for it. But there is one aspect in particular of these games that okay, right now, as of this recording, I'm just kind of like in the brainstorming phase of things, just like planning out, how am I even going to try to tackle this rewrite, how different routes will go, how I'll handle revelations and potentially the DLC stuff. Um, and I've got a lot of that more or less figured out, but there is one specific aspect of Fire Emblem Fates that has been driving me up an absolute wall trying to make sense of. And that is the freaking Deep Realms. Now, anyone who's even like remotely familiar with this concept probably knows how much of an absolute mess these things are. But in case you're not aware, let's back up a bit and take some context. So, as many people know, Fire Emblem Awakening was a massive turning point for the Fire Emblem franchise as a whole. The narrative goes that this game single handedly saved the Fire Emblem franchise, and while I think that might be a little bit of an over exaggeration, the fact is that the Fire Emblem franchise up until that point had not been selling super, super well worldwide, or even in any particular nation. So, like, from a business standpoint, it would probably make sense to make that a much, much lower priority series going forward. But yeah, like, regardless of, how much you want to read into that, Fire Emblem Awakening was a massive success for the FE franchise as a whole. It did massive numbers, it brought in a lot of new players, it made a lot of innovations to the series as a whole that were, for the most part, relatively well received. Um, and, again, it's widely praised as like the savior of this entire series. So, when Fates came around, it's little surprise that it tried to bring back a lot of the elements that were regarded as making Fire Emblem Awakening so popular. And two of these elements were the dating sim mechanics and the child units. Now, the latter sounds a lot more ominous than it actually is, but let's back up a bit. So, mild spoilers for Awakening if you haven't played that or seen anything from that like decade-old game by now. Um, so the plot of Fire Emblem Awakening involves a bit of time travel. So like you start the game off with like what is called the first generation cast, right? These include characters like, your starter character, Robin, Chrom, Frederick, Lisa, and so on. Um, but then at a certain point in the game, you're introduced to Lucina, who is Chrom's daughter from the future. She has come back in time because her world was completely and utterly wrecked by the fell dragon Grima. And the situation was so bad that the only option that she and her allies really had left, especially after the first generation units were all basically killed off in her timeline, was just to, again, go back in time and try to stop Grima from ever waking up, or at least beating him before he had the chance to, kill everyone and destroy the world. So, this created a rather interesting situation where certain characters from the future came back in time with Lucina, but they wound up kind of scattered all over the place. Um, and so you would unlock paralogs in which you can encounter and recruit these heroes based on whether or not you had certain first generation characters marry, right? So, like, for example, Morgan is Robin's kid from the future. They can be either male or female, depending on the gender that you chose to make your Robin. But if you have Robin S support anyone that they can S support in the game, then you will unlock the paralog in which you can recruit Morgan into the army. And this was a neat concept, right? And it worked well enough with the premise of, having like time traveling characters coming back to, fight alongside their parents and whatever. Um, but this concept would also try to be brought forward into Fire Emblem Fates, which did not have any element of time travel in its story. So immediately, the issue of trying to justify these second generation characters, these kids that you could unlock and recruit based on whether you had certain characters in your army get married, it was a little harder to justify this time around. Understandably so. Um, so the solution that they came up with was the Deeprealms. So the Deeprealms are like these little magical pocket dimensions that are relatively cut off from the rest of the world. They're their own like little inhabitable spaces that can only be accessed by certain people through very special means. So the idea is that a character in your army in Fire Emblem Fates would get married, then immediately have a kid, despite the fact that a war was still actively happening in the story, because that's obviously a great time to choose to conceive a child. Um, and then the kid is born, which already implies that like every time you S support, you're skipping forward like several months. Um, which itself makes the timeline of the entire game a bit of a mess, but don't worry about that too much, I guess. But then, yeah, so you have your characters S support, and they have a kid, and then because, you know, we decide, oh, so a war is a great time to conceive a child, but clearly it's not a safe environment to raise a child. So we're just gonna stick this kid in a deep realm for a while and let them grow up there under the supervision of like special caretakers that we assign to the task. The problem, though, or the problem in universe but convenient for out of universe, is that Time in the Deep Realms moves much, much faster than it does in the regular world. The exact extent is not super clear, but it's like you put a child who's like an infant in the Deep Realms for like a couple months, and then you go to visit them, and suddenly now they're a young adult. So, you know, you're basically like getting to miss your kid's entire childhood, say for like a couple of exceptions, like Midori, I guess, who you recruit into the army when she's still very young for some reason. Um, but yeah, so it's like this is meant to justify again, like your characters can have a kid and then suddenly they're just old enough to fight instantly. Again, except for like a couple of like the really weird exceptions where you're recruiting again characters like Midori or Percy who are again like still preteen, I think, by the time you recruit them. I don't understand this choice at all. Um, but yeah, it's just like a very convenient way to age up the characters so that they can be at least roughly within like fighting ability. But it creates a whole mess from a larger narrative perspective, right? Like the choice to even have kids during the war, the complete convolution that is the Deep Realms as a whole. It is just it's so nonsensical, but again, it's clearly meant to just kind of be a way to excuse bringing back the second generation gimmick from Awakening. Which again is like I don't even like entirely blame them because it is a neat idea, but again, it doesn't really work in a plot without that time travel aspect involved, right? And it especially does not make sense in the context of the story of Fire Emblem Fates, whichever route you choose to go with. But again, like it's just the Deep Realms are like the best compromise they really had on short notice. And the obvious solution at first might just be remove the Deep Realms and remove the Deep Realm kids entirely, because that seems like the only immediately obvious solution, because, you know, having a kid during the wars is a really stupid idea in general. The problem is that the Deep Realm kids are actually, as a whole, not bad characters. Like, a lot of them are actually some, like, fan favorites of the community as a whole. And I don't want to just ditch them altogether in my rewrite. So I have been struggling for some months now to try to figure out a solution to this conundrum. And I still haven't really found a perfect solution, if I'm being completely real. The best I currently have is the idea of having some kind of time skip element in the story. And this is all still like very rough draft, you know, brainstorming at the moment. I just feel like I really need to just get this out there to like share the frustration of like trying to work with the Deep Realms and the Deep Realms kids in this narrative. And it's like the only thing I can really think of off the top of my head is in the birthright and conquest routes, you don't learn the truth behind the real antagonist of the game, right? Like that's the whole point of Revelations being the true path that reveals, you know, Anonkos and all of his BS and him being like the true instigator of the war and the entire plot, yada yada yada, right? Um, in Conquest and Birthright, you manage to stall Anonkos' plans by beating Garen, who is effectively his puppet, and also possess Takumi, I guess, in the Conquest route specifically. But like Anonkos is still theoretically a problem in those two routes. So like the only thing I can think of is like having a sort of like I guess turning like Revelations into maybe like a Delta episode from Pokemon, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, right? Where it's like it's just a third post game plot where it's like sometime after the war, Anonkos reveals himself and becomes like the true villain, and like this like enough time has passed that like the war is over. The characters in your armies have had time to have kids become parents, and then those kids can grow up, and then it kind of could maybe become like an Heirs of Fate thing because there was a DLC chapter called The Heirs of Fate, which is, as it sounds, a whole DLC chapter just kind of focusing on the Deeprealms kids as protagonists. And like Realms of Fate is also kind of a convoluted mess because it involves like multiverse timeline shenanigans, Anonkos or another version of Anonkos, like merging the conquest and birthrights routes, and like the kids from Hoshido and Nor from both routes having to work together to fight him, and Shigure also gets like a special rendition of Lost in Thoughts. Um, it's a whole thing, but you get like both Kanas getting to merge their Yatos together, so you get two flaming chainsaw swords. It's a whole thing, but yeah, like the premise of having like the second generation just be their own story and get their own storyline is a neat touch. Whether this would mean like killing off the first generation characters or having to like reassemble the army to fight Anonkos with the second generation, that could be a whole option. Admittedly, though, like the issue there is you'd theoretically be jumping forward, like I want to say 17 to 20 years, give or take, for most of these kids to exist and be old enough to fight. So, like, you would probably have to then come up with, like, time skip versions of all the first generation characters, right? Like, show what everyone looks like again over a decade later, which in of itself could be a fun idea. Like, I certainly would not mind. Like, time skip designs are always fun. I really loved, how like Three Houses and Three Hopes did that sort of thing. But you know, having to come up with new alternate designs for each and every member of the first generation cast might be a bit of a hassle. So yeah, I guess the point of all of this is really just addressing the fact that like the Deep Realm kids exist in a very unfortunate situation because they are genuinely fun characters, and I feel like they have a lot to offer the story as characters, even with Fate's admittedly sometimes subpar character writing. But the issue is that they just kind of exist in this really weird, awkward situation where their entire existence in the plot as is comes off as just incredibly, incredibly forced and contrived. And there's not really a super inelegant solution to solving that issue. And, like part of the other issue that has also yet to be addressed is the fact that Fire Emblem Fates is like the first Fire Emblem game that like well and truly established queer relationships as a thing in the game. By which I mean you can romance Rajat as female Corin and you can romance Niles as male Corin, and those are like your only queer options in the entire game. There's other like kind of queer coded characters, like again the extremely bi coded Soleil. Um, but you know, one thing that a lot of people do wish that Fates leaned in on more is having more same sex relationships just be as options. Which is something I certainly would not be opposed to. Like, there is something out there called the Gay Fates mod, or as I like to call it, the Gates mod. But it does pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. It adds a whole bunch of potential queer relationships out there, as well as just in general, like some more, like it even adds like more straight relationships as well, and even more like unique dialogues between some of the mothers and the child units, because that's another issue of the Deep Realm kids. Like, with the exception of Shigure and male Kana, the moms for the Deep Realm kids don't really matter. Most of the Deep Realms kids are sons or daughters of the male members of the first generation cast. And so they get unique interactions with their dads, but the moms just kind of get like generic supports regardless of who they are. And that is a very weird situation, to be sure. I think the reason they did this is so that they'd have to worry less about like potential sibling combinations and having to write different interactions for different sibling pairings as well. Like, I get it's just in general probably to make it easier for the dev team to not have to make like a whole bunch of, you know, additional support lines in a game that already has so many, right? Like, you just have like one generic support for, a character and their mom, and then you don't really have to worry about sibling pairings aside from like again Shigure and Orkana. But again, it is admittedly kind of a shame. Um, but yeah, of course, the Gay Fates mod has it be, you can have plenty of, guys get together with other guys. You can have plenty of girls get together with other girls, and it even has, additional dialogues for the sibling supports because yeah, it still has you able to unlock these paralogs and have the kids exist even if you put their dads in a same-sex relationship, which would imply either adoption or like reproduction in Fire Emblem Fates just works differently as a whole. That's a whole other topic that like can get into admittedly some very uncomfortable territory, so I don't want to delve too deep into that any further. It's just another potential issue that might have to be addressed if you were to, think about this whole debacle for nearly as long as I have. Like the mod itself doesn't really even like address it really. It's just like, yeah, like you can have Nina just have two dads and don't really worry too much about the implications behind how she even exists in that case. Uh, I don't know, like maybe you can say, yeah, in Fire Emblem Fates, like they are actually just delivered on a stork or whatever. Um, but yeah, just the Deep Realm kids are a mess. It is a very messy plot point with a lot of problems kind of attached to it in general. And it's a little wonder why this plot point is so widely disliked by the broader community. But regardless, I'm going to try to find a way to make it work. But if you happen to have any suggestions, by all means, feel free to share them. I am totally open to ideas. But with all that being said, thank you all for tuning in tonight. And I suppose I'll see you all next time. Until then, stay bright.